Okay, if all goes according to plan, you can hear me. You're all here, captive audience for this workshop. I hope this is what you're here for, because that's what I'm offering. And we're gonna get right into it. First, I'll say hi, Mom. My mom is from Texas, so I'm in her home state. She's from Corpus. Show of hands, how many Texas natives are in the building? Really cool. I've got to calibrate my jokes. I live on the West Coast, so there's some things I'm not going to say today. All right, let's get into it before I get myself in trouble. The clicker's going. Let's press buttons. Wonderful. So who am I? We'll get to that in the next slide. I work for a small diversity strategy firm called ReadySet. We're based in Oakland, California. We work, yes, wonderful. Yeah, I don't know who that is, but I really like this person. We work with tech, nonprofit, social impact, people really trying to do the work. And I haven't really read the words that I pasted onto the slide, but I'm sure they're true of us, and I feel deeply aligned with them. Let's move forward. Who am I? I tell folks I'm the kind of introvert that comes alive with a microphone, so I'll be hiding in the back, crying, playing a little Sade once this is over. I started my career with a tiny company called Accenture. That was something. And now I do other things. Started an online magazine for black men called Abernathy about 4 or 5 years ago. And that was like an intellectual coming of age for me. There was a lot going on. Wow, these monitors are going on and off. This is thrilling. It's thrilling. And that really opened the door to what I do for a living now, facilitating conversations across difference, reminding ourselves of the things that we have in common, more so than the things that divide us. And I really fell in love with that work, so I now have the good fortune and the pleasure of doing that for a living, and we might even make it through this slide deck as we talk about this. I made books, I was on TV, let's move on. Our suggested community agreements for today are as follows. This typically applies when people can be a bit more disruptive, but who knows? Let's just say them out of an abundance of caution. Take space, make space. What does that mean? If you have your thoughts come to you fully formed from on high, you know exactly what you want to say when you want to say it, maybe make space for people who need a moment to get their thoughts together, to kind of form the words that are coming to mind. By all means, take the knowledge and learnings out with you, but anything personally attributable that people share, let's leave that in the room, create a nice, safe, cozy container for people to show up authentically. Let's refrain from judgment. This work can be hard, and none of us have arrived. It can be a real challenge to do this work, so let's refrain from judgment as we stretch and try and find our growth edges in this work. Let's recognize intent, let's assume best intent, but also own impact. If something lands a little funny for somebody else, let's apologize, name it, and move forward so we can get back to the show. And if anything is unclear, I'd love to know what's coming up for you. So ask questions. I hope to serve as a useful translator for some of this work to the degree that I can. And if that sounds good, that's what we're going to do today. Does that sound good? Fair? Wonderful. You didn't have much say in the matter, I recognize, but our objectives for today are as follows. Number one, we want to understand the difference between being an ally as compared to being an accomplice, right? What does that word mean? Why are we using this somewhat subversive language to describe the work? Number two, as I say, your number one job as an ally is to listen some more, and to listen again. And when you've done that, how do you take powerful, informed action that's relevant and appropriate to the situation? And finally, this is not a framework of prevention. We don't believe it's possible to learn enough to never make a mistake. So the real question is, how do we bring our values to bear with grace and dignity and integrity when we step in it, right? When we make a mistake, when we're moving too quickly, when we're maybe careless with our words, and we say something that we regret. Or maybe we uncover belief that's outdated within ourselves that needs to be updated, and that doesn't align with where we stand now. You know, how do we recover when things go wrong? Those are the things that we'd like to go through today. How do you define allyship? I'd love it if you could turn to somebody sitting next to you and share how you might define that word. By a show of hands, I'd love for somebody to share. We've got mics going around, I hope. We've got microphones going around. Yes, this gentleman. Does anybody want to share a definition of allyship? I insist. I see a hand in the back.
Thought about it as how organizations might think about themselves as allies, where you might have similar values held as another organization that has more expertise might be more proximate to an issue that you care about, and you're willing to take cues from them and how to show up in ways that can be productive and helpful.
Beautiful. What's your name?
Marvin Smith.
Marvin, thank you so much. So I hear in that some self-awareness, right? Organizational self-awareness. I hear some humility, right? Being able to let somebody else take the lead and recognize when somebody else is, as you mentioned, more proximate to a particular issue. And kind of an awareness of the general landscape. So I love that you approach it from the organizational level. What else? How might we define allyship, maybe interpersonally or on a personal, individual level? How might somebody define that? I see a hand up here, I see a hand here.
It's when someone supports that person in their choices and is non-judgmental.
Beautiful. Non-judgmental. I love the non-judgmental piece as well. Anybody else want to share a definition of allyship? Over here. Oh, yes.
We talked about a component behaviorally. It is.
Can you one more time?
So my name is Adrian from PepsiCo. We talked about behaviorally. It is speaking up when it's convenient, but also when there are consequences to speaking up.
Ooh, I love that. We're going to get into some of that a little bit later. Another definition while we work on our AV. Let's just get some definitions going. Right over here. Well, actually, the people with mics are in charge, so whoever talks, go for it.
I was just going to say we talked a lot about supporting, but I think it's seeking to fully understand and then fully support.
Yeah.
So understanding someone thoroughly for who and what they are, and then fully supporting them no matter the consequences.
And what does that understanding require as a prerequisite?
Self-awareness, for
Awareness.
sure. To
What else?
understand where your own limitations and boundaries are before
Sure.
you can overcome anything that maybe is holding you back from understanding somebody else.
Wonderful. Maybe also some listening, right? Knowing where you are, where other people might be as well. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Daniel from T-Mobile. We talked about sharing in the cause. So when we think about like our resource teams, maybe being a voice for those individuals who are not in the room.
Oh, I love that. I love that definition. Please, just start talking. Yeah, I
We
can't say
talked
anything.
about simultaneously working with another person towards a common end, but also individually in relationship to one another, willing the good of the other person as well.
I really like that. Yeah, recognizing just the nature of really the fact that we're not in this alone, the fact that there are stakes to this work, which I think someone over here mentioned, and the fact that there might be consequences for this action, and really underscoring the way in which we're all just in this together. There's a relational component and dynamic to this. Thank you all for your comments. Was there somebody with the microphone just itching to, all right, let's do it. Oh, you're mad at me? Don't be mad at me. By way of history, how many of you are familiar with the Combahee River Collective? Show of hands. I see no hands. Wonderful. So this was a radical lesbian feminist black organization active in Boston from 1974 to 1980. They sprung out of the need for basically their identities, their lived experiences. They weren't seeing themselves represented in the white feminist movement of the day. So famously, they were striving against oppression on the basis of race, class, and gender. But they also introduced to us the notion of oppression on the basis of sexuality, right? And they analyzed these as forces that were working together. They said the synthesis of these forces creates the conditions for our lives. So they were fighting alongside black men against racism of the day, but against black men to fight sexism of the day, right? So this more expansive notion of what resistance on the basis of our fundamental identity might look like. To that end, it might surprise some of us to learn that they originated the term identity politics. So they said this focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept, or the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics comes directly out of our own identity. So this lays, for me, the intellectual groundwork for some of the words, phrases, and terms and frameworks that we now use in a contemporary conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Specifically, intersectionality. How many of you have heard this term? How many of you could define it if we threw a microphone at you? Oh, wonderful. Let's get the microphone right here.
I'm going to give a base definition.
Okay.
So intersectionality is we are going the same place, but we're coming from different places.
Beautiful. Yeah, why don't you give us a 201? That was good.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Essentially, that yes, there are identities and there are experiences that are shared between us. However, there are that are not. And at the places that they intersect is typically where we have challenges because ultimately you don't feel me.
That's right.
You understand.
Well said. Thank you so much. The reason it's important to define some of the terms that we now use, particularly in our current political climate, is because they become so watered down. We don't often take the time to define them. Intersectionality for a lot of the companies that I work with often means inclusion, and that's not actually what it means. By show of hands, how many of you are familiar with Kimberly Crenshaw? Have heard of her? Fabulous. Congratulations. So Kimberly Crenshaw is a critical race theorist, constitutional law scholar. She's at Columbia and I believe UCLA. 30 years ago, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality when she was looking at class action lawsuits filed by black women against General Motors. She needed a legal framework and an analysis and a way of showing the way in which race and gender were working together to create a new vector for oppression. So specifically and famously, a judge threw out one of the cases because he saw that General Motors employed white women and black men. So he said, your case is invalid. So again, she needed a way to illustrate the way in which race and gender are working together to create something new and unique, specifically a vector of oppression and discrimination in the context of these lawsuits that she was looking at. So our working definition for intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations. We're talking about race, class, and gender, among other things, and these are overlapping and interdependent. You can't have one without the other. The experiences of black women in the workplace can't solely be explained through the lens of race or gender or by comparing them to white women or black men, right? These things are working together to create something new and unique, and this is one of the ways in which we miss each other, right? When social groups are categorized and grouped together, when we look at our employee engagement data and we assume that all women are having similar experiences or people of color writ large are having a particular kind of experience, that's not the way this actually works. We need to look more courageously at the data, the anecdotes, the lived experiences, and the things that people are telling us in order to have a better understanding of what's going on within our workplaces. So again, it's the interlap. I can't do my little laser. Can I do my laser? Boom, I can do my laser. So it's where these things are overlapping, right? At the intersection of our race, our sexual orientation, our gender expression, the things that make us unique. These can also serve as blinders, right? We only have an N of one. We only know the way in which we show up. We only know how we're moving through the world. But if one thing about you is different from somebody else, you're gonna have a completely different experience on the basis of where your privileges lie, of where your disadvantages lie, and so forth. So this whole framework is predicated upon the notion of moving from allyship to being an accomplice. The reason we use the term accomplice is to underscore the fact that this work might cost you something. It might be your social standing, it might be your comfort, and it's rooted in history, right? It was not until a very few years ago that we had the ability, gay marriage was possible. There were laws in the books against sodomy, gay sex in many parts of the South until very, very recently, right? My father was 19 when Martin Luther King Jr. got shot. So history is still present with us, and we live in a deeply ahistorical context, so I think it bears repeating how long ago it wasn't when many of us, many people in this room, could not enjoy many of the privileges that we currently do. So if an ally, I guess I'll back up one more. The reason why I want to invite you to think about moving from the notion of being an ally to the notion of being an accomplice is because I find it to be much more psychologically and emotionally resilient. So if, for example, you're so invested in being seen as an ally, which is to say seen as always doing the right thing, you never want to make a mistake, you never want to make a misstep, you never want to hurt somebody or harm somebody in something that you say or something that you do. If you make a mistake and somebody calls you out on the basis of something you said that landed a little funny for them, maybe they felt like you made something that was said something that was racially insensitive, if you're so invested in being seen as never making a mistake, if you're so invested in the notion of perfection and being an ally in that way, it stands to reason that you might overcorrect, you might lash out at that person and say, you don't know, you don't understand me. I read everything there is to read about Kimberly Crenshaw. I can define intersectionality right now. I march with Dr. King, like things go off the rails really quickly. Thank you. If by contrast you view your work as being an accomplice, which is to say the set of actions or what you're doing in practice, it's actually a good thing, it's a generous thing. It can be a generous thing to be called out or ideally called in for a mistake that you've made, because you can do better next time, right? Because that blind spot can be illuminated. So if an ally is an identity, somebody that sees themselves as an expert, somebody that often centers themselves, right? When conversations about difference come up and you can't get a word in edgewise, they know everything about pay equity, they know everything about gender equity, they have the right answer. I see some people laughing here. Don't be that person. And if you're that person, retire today. This person can become complacent in that identity as well. If, by contrast, you're viewing your work as an accomplice in terms of what your allyship means in practice, what's what you're doing, right? Somebody that's an active listener. So we talked a little bit about that situational awareness, that humility that comes along with knowing how to partner with somebody from the perspective of an ally. In order to do that, you have to understand what it is that you don't know. And so by honing our listening skills, by listening for the thing that we might not know about somebody else's lived experience, we can become a better accomplice. We need a North Star in this work. We can't save everybody in all directions every day. Some people have to run our companies and organizations. And so we invite you to think about centering impacted communities, people that have been historically marginalized by a lack of access to resources or education, or communities that have been negatively impacted by the criminal justice system, and so forth. And finally, above all else, I think the foundation upon which all of this rests is the ability to make a mistake, the ability to recognize that you are not perfect, right? So this notion of fallibility really is at the root of being an accomplice and carrying this vital work of allyship forward. So what does an accomplice do? Number one, center impacted communities. Number two, take action. Number three, we use our privilege. And number four, we exhibit humility.
There was an acceptance by her that this was unfair, that Jessica Chastain recognized that it wasn't right. And whether she used the words or the look on her face, there was an acknowledgement that a mistake had been made.
That's right. And I think they were on the phone, actually. So what was the very first thing Octavia Spencer says that Jessica Chastain did? What was the very first thing that she did? She was quiet. She listened, right? She did not know. And she's fired up about gender pay equity, right? Trying to enroll her friend in the gender equity campaign. And Octavia Spencer said, I need to tell you a secret. Right? I need to tell you something that you might not know. So there was some risk that was taken, right? You know, she could have, Jessica Chastain could have reacted poorly to a monkey wrench being thrown in her campaign. What could her reaction have been like? What are some other ways in which Jessica Chastain could have responded to what Octavia Spencer shared? You got a microphone.
Yeah, so dismissive or explaining away, well, maybe this is the reason why that happened. Maybe it's the certain films that you chose that led to that outcome.
Yeah, I think the kids call this victim blaming, right? Like she could have easily deflected, justified it, said, oh, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And really shifted the onus right back to Octavia Spencer. And that would have been that, right? And we know that this reliably happens between friends because we don't hear about these stories, right? What else do we notice? See a hand in the middle.
I noticed that she was so surprised that her friend was willing to jump into that fight with her.
Yeah.
That not only was she didn't really recognize it when she took that pause, but that she was all in, like, oh, okay, hold my beer. We're gonna get this for both of us. Like, hold on, we're gonna do this.
The solidarity is so
surprised
beautiful.
that she hadn't had that partnership and that solidarity.
100%. 100%. Yeah, I love using this example because it helps to expand our creative imagination of what's possible when we stick our neck out for each other, when we get creative about solutions, and what can be done that's a bit more than what we tend to do. Let's see, what else? Yes, I see two hands.
Sorry, excuse me. This side. Sorry, right here.
Fight.
Yeah, one of the things that I really noticed was the reciprocation of the being an accomplice. So as soon as she felt like she was heard and she felt like there was an advocacy for her, that she immediately said, Jessica Chastain is walking the walk, and she advocated right back. And so I think that being able to see that is going to drive more of that accomplice and more of that advocacy, because you can see it's like almost transactional in a way too.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And let's acknowledge, like, neither of these women are missing meals. They're both award-winning, successful Hollywood actresses. So we're not talking about somebody on the come up and looking for the big break. But that also, for me, underscores how grave this issue is. Octavia Spencer is a successful, award-winning Hollywood actress, obviously carrying the burdens and the wounds from a lifetime of not making what she deserves to make. So it took her talking numbers with her friend, in order to illustrate the way in which she has been. Yes, please.
I think one of the things that came across to me was the willingness to have that exchange of information, because when we talk about intersectionality, like you did, which was great, they have two very different viewpoints.
That's
and I
right.
think also sometimes it's uncomfortable for people to talk about race, but they were willing and vulnerable enough to not only talk about it, to hear each other, and then to come together and work together.
Well, and it's not just the conversation about race, but doing something about that, right?
Right.
Like actually taking action about this. You still have something?
She covered it.
Okay. What else? Please.
Well, mine kind of, I guess, maybe piggyback off of what the other young lady was saying. But I was really giving kudos to Octavia for even, acknowledging and having that self-awareness to say, well, thank you for the opportunity, but I need to bring this to the table, because that's the greatest challenge, is standing up for yourself in that indifference and being able to bring light to it, and having that courage to say, I actually do want to be a part of the conversation and I want to have this opportunity, but I have to highlight this huge elephant that you honestly may not see. It's an elephant for us in the room, but you may not see. And it's kind of like what we mentioned at the beginning of the conversation when you asked her, how do we get to that? And it's that transparency and that self-awareness and being able to say, well, actually, here, let me be vulnerable. And then us having that ally and holding each other accountable for that. So.
Beautifully said. Yeah, beautifully said. And she didn't just say black women, right? She said women of color, right? So she's at a position where she could have just advocated for herself or just went along with it, right? But she advocated for herself, and she's trying to blow that door open, right? So all these downstream benefits can be seen. I think we have time for one more. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm kind of blown away by the fact that she got 5 times more than she was asking for. Why didn't she ask for more in the first place? Sounds like she's underpaid, probably. Still.
Well, yeah, that is the entire issue here, right? So if we look at pay equity as an issue, and we cut that not only by race, but by gender as well, there are some enormous disparities that I think a lot of us are still grappling with. So I agree. Let's move on. How many of you recognize this? Oh, actually, I have one more thing to point out. Who's telling the story here? Like, who's owning this narrative? Like, are we on the Jessica Chastain, white savior, TED Talk Power Hour? No, I think the fact that Octavia Spencer is owning the narrative, telling the story, and obviously processing something that's very recent. I think she said a week prior is when this was.
Well, I have a.
Is when the good news came. So I wanted to underscore the fact that it's vital for folks to be able to own that narrative and to stand to that in the way that feels empowering for them. Okay, how many of you recognize this guy? What about when he's dressed up for work? Yeah, it's Thor from the Marvel franchise. In 2016, he did something awkward. That is him here. He was invited to a Lone Star party. This is one of the jokes I can't make when I'm in Texas right now. So he went to a Lone Star party. Just gonna leave that alone. And he did something unexpected. So let's actually name this. So this is culturally insensitive. Call this cultural appropriation. He's wearing somebody's identity as a costume. And for those of you who have been living under a rock, America has a very complicated relationship with indigenous folks and First Nations people, so just to name that. And he apologized afterwards. Take a moment and read this. Sounds like a PR release, like a press release, right? Sounds like the thing that somebody would type out in the iPhone Notes app, screenshot, and post on Twitter. Yes, please.
I mean, he did share what happened and said that he was unaware. I think to your point around the PR, there's a lot of adjectives there to kind of take the blame away.
Yep.
But I think he could have tied a bow around it if he would have said, you know, I did this, and now because I did this, now I'm going to do this. Like, be specific about what are you going to do about it in some small way. That's what stands out for me.
Yeah, he said way too many words here. Just way too many words. I mean, part of me jokes that he, well-paid team of interns put together a really thoughtful apology, but he kind of ruined it. What I do appreciate that he said, I appreciate, good grief. I appreciate that he's using the right terminology. He's talking about the complex and extensive issues facing indigenous communities. He's talking about First Nations people. I appreciate that. And also, let's see, I sincerely and unreservedly apologize to all First Nations people for this thoughtless action. That's like 90% of what he needed to say. All this other stuff, I could probably take or leave. We're short on time, so I'm going to sally forth. He did afterwards, what I just shared was a comment on the Instagram post where he posted this video. This is him using his star power in full Thor regalia to highlighting the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. That's the director of Thor 4 and Thor Ragnarok on my right, maybe your left. So besides everything, what can go wrong? How many of you heard the term white fragility? Raise your hand if you have not. Fabulous, I'm in Texas talking about white fragility. Dr. Robin DiAngelo is a sociologist who's been doing this racial equity work for, 18, 20 years. And she coined this term in a paper several years ago, but wrote a book on the topic more recently. I believe this came out in 2017. There's a longer definition. It starts with, white people in North America live in a racial environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress. And she goes on to describe the behaviors that she can see, that we can all see, when conversations across difference take place. She specifically refers to it as a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves, such as fear and guilt, argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation, which is to say, walking out of the room, ending the conversation, and so forth. I name this because it's a dynamic that we can often see when we're having conversations across difference. And maybe even it might even be the thing preventing us from having those uncomfortable conversations in the first place. We are not good at talking about race in America, certainly not across lines of difference in ways that are productive. This book is a fantastic resource, and I can share our resources document with everybody if that's interesting to you about the book's phrases, terminology, and media that we're including in this workshop. So what have we internalized along the way? I'm, a product of the homophobic, patriarchal South. I had a big house in the suburb once upon a time, and I remember cleaning the house up one weekend, and I put up a status update. I guess I was just over, the domestic life, and I said something to the effect of, I'm tired of cleaning the house, now accepting girlfriend applications. I was a real catch, right? Sorry. A couple of my very patient female friends commented thoughtfully, and they said, you don't need a girlfriend, you need a maid. And I just thought they weren't funny, they didn't have a really good sense of humor, and maybe that was true, but the point is, I had some enormous blind spots that I had deeply internalized. I had so associated traditional gender roles with the sense that women cleaned up the house, and maybe some people don't have an issue with that notion, but the fact that it was so reflexively baked into my perspective means that you can probably extrapolate out my gender politics from there, that blind spot. What that means in practice for a lot of people in the workplace, and what I would highlight, is the way in which women, for example, are expected to do the administrative work, to do the calendaring, to set the rooms up before people arrive, to carry forth the agenda, to take notes, and so forth. And we're all complicit in upholding these systems that reliably create more labor, practical and emotional and otherwise, for different groups. So I want to invite us to think about the way in which our blind spots might be perpetuating these things that actually are oppressing people in the context of our workplace. I'd be curious, have any of you overcome, or were any of you socialized, oh wow, we don't have a lot of time. Have any of you been socialized in a context that you've had to unlearn some things? Maybe you grew up in a particularly insular environment. I see some hands going up. Yeah, we've had to unlearn a lot of things along the way, and I just want to name the fact that where we grew up, the communities that we were a part of, the way in which we were treated by our guardians and loved ones has a huge impact on how we see ourselves. If you grew up as a person of color, low income, and you had to work your way through college, you had to fight your way to make a living while you were studying and take lower paying jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you're gonna have a completely set of different lived experiences that you've internalized as compared to a tall, good-looking Chris Hemsworth dominant group person who grew up with maybe a bit of affluence or privilege, and you had your choice of jobs along the way. They're just a different set of experience and expectations, things like, the value of hard work, how far hard work can get you, the standard of excellence required just to be seen in the workplace. These things are going to be different. So what happens when we feel attacked? What we know is that cortisol and adrenaline rise in the bloodstream, and the body goes into a fight, flight, or freeze response. And the thing I say is we don't automatically bring our best values to bear. We actually sink to the level of our training and our practice. Like, we don't rise to the level of our values when we're in these stress-inducing situations. So we actually have to practice how we're going to respond when things go wrong, because we're not actually primed by our biology to be successful. So what can you do in 4 minutes or less? Number one, educate yourself. That's exposing yourself to media, books, literature, and so forth that maybe wasn't written with you in mind, right? Expanding our worldviews and our perspectives. Where necessary, receive consent and buy-in. Don't just assume that somebody needs your advocacy or your support in the way that you assume that they need it. Jumping into an email thread, butting in a conversation. It's actually really vital to get buy-in because people need to have agency over their futures and their lived experience. Following support, supporting leaders from marginalized groups. We can see Chris Hemsworth modeling that in the picture a few slides back. Following your discomfort. If something is moving you to the edges of your comfort zone, I'd ask that you sit with that discomfort and see if it has something to offer you. And if you make a mistake, you misgender somebody, you say the wrong thing, you make an insensitive comment, and you're called out for it, don't explain away how it was okay where you grew up. Just apologize. Don't create a hostage situation. What are some things that we can do? Mentorship. If you have a discrete skill set, you grew up talking about money around the dinner table, or you know how to advocate for yourself, you know how to ask for a raise, you know how to fundraise, these are vital, discrete skills that we can offer somebody else. You don't necessarily have to join Big Brothers, Big Sisters to be a mentor. You can do this in the context of your team and your workplace. Sponsorship, I think somebody named this earlier, perhaps not by the word, but advocating for somebody who's not in the room, letting somebody know that you should go for this job that's coming up, and maybe offering some advice on how to go for that role, how to go for that opportunity. And then advocating for them when they're not in the room. If you have access to a table or a team or a group of influential people that can in which you have sway over the decision being made there, you can use that proximity to that advantage, right? Exhibiting optimistic curiosity about somebody's lived experience instead of just assuming that we know what they're like on the basis of how they present to the world. It's a great tip as well. Speaking up. Sometimes this might involve standing up for somebody who's being talked over in a meeting. Sometimes that might look like something a bit more daring or courageous. Making a recommendation, giving public praise, standing up for somebody. These are all things that we can do. A quick module on bias. How do we define bias? It's an aversion or affinity to a person or group of people on the basis of identity or inherent characteristics. We typically think we're talking about race and gender, but it's actually a lot more expansive. If your belief system has a huge impact on how you show up in the world, the things you do and don't do, that can count. Class, socioeconomic status, age. We don't talk enough about ageism in tech in particular, where I work. Native language, disability status, and so forth. 2 interpersonal biases to know. Like me bias is exactly what it sounds like. It's our propensity to be attracted towards or gravitate towards people that look, act, and think like us. Leniency bias is when we're much more likely to understand or give people a pass on the basis of that same understanding. When you put these things together, you can see how it's people that aren't like us are less likely to be extended that understanding and that grace. We see that in interviewing, and these things work together, right? These aren't discrete things that are operating in vacuums. These things all work together, right? And they're completely natural. That's why we have to talk about them. That's why we have to notice them and recognize them and ask our colleagues to hold us accountable when we feel we might be perpetuating these biases. So how does it manifest? At Ready Set, we're less concerned with whether bias is conscious or unconscious, intentional or unintentional. We care about how it manifests. So in some ways, it's easy to spot rudeness, discourteous behavior, ignoring somebody, talking over somebody, but even tone of voice and avoiding eye contact are ways that we can see this interpersonal bias manifest. We don't actually have time to go through all this, so I'm gonna just say that it's been really nice to talk to you all here. I've really enjoyed our time together, but I'm the kind of person that ends the conversation on time. So if you point your QR code reader or your iPhone at this slide, I'm happy to send you the resources document, and we can finish this conversation about the bias framework. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it.